This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Hannam.
And I'm Jamal Dajani.
Jamal, we have a really great show today. We're going to be covering a number of topics today. We've been talking about this ruling by Kogat, the Israeli military kind of authority that oversees policies in the West Bank and Gaza, but mostly the West Bank, obviously. And they're going to revisit their so-called policy of visitors to the West Bank having to disclose basically who their intimate partners are. And we're going to discuss that revisiting of that issue. We're going to talk a little bit about the colonial history. You know, we're in the midst of today, Queen Elizabeth II is being laid to rest, and there's a long history of colonial exploitation, obviously, in the context of her burial today and the ascendance of the new monarch, King Charles, and that colonial history extends to Palestine. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and kind of put that in some context. But before we get to those items, we're going to watch an interview that you did with Dr. Rania Masri and Anis Germani. We're going to talk about, the tremendous political, economic, and social upheaval going on in Lebanon right now. We've kind of lost sight of that, Jamal, but Lebanon it's beyond saying that's in crisis. You have a society, both economically, politically, and socially, that's basically tearing apart. The sectarianism. Last week, people had to rob a bank in order to get their money out of their own savings out of their account.
More than 7 people, I think 7 or 9 people.
Yeah.
Now it's becoming a trend. Imagine you want to get your money from your bank, you have to
and you got to rob it. Exactly. So, but that speaks to the kind of manifestation of how fragile and how catastrophic things are for Lebanon right now, in addition to the million or so, Syrian refugees that are still trying to adjust there. So really great show today.
Yeah, so let's watch Dr. Rania Masri and Dr. Anis Germani. Lebanon, described in the past as the Switzerland of the Middle East, is now mired in the worst economic crisis its citizens have faced in decades. A collapse that day by day is pushing Lebanese citizens to the brink, many of whom have tried to leave the country in precarious boats, joining a wave of migration that continues to grow. Recently, angry Lebanese have forced their way into as many as 7 banks to access trapped savings as the country's crippling financial crisis pushes people to take the law into their own hands. According to data published by the United Nations, 8 out of 10 Lebanese live below poverty line. Joining us to discuss this and more, Dr. Rania Masri, university professor and member of the political movement مواطنين ومواطنات في دولة, translated as citizens in a state, and Dr. Anis Germani, a political activist and a medical doctor. Welcome to both of you. Glad to have you back on Arab Talk.
Pleasure to be with you.
So since we last spoke in the summer of 2021, the economic crisis has deteriorated rapidly. Dr. Germani, please summarize some key factors that dug Lebanon deeper into this economical quagmire.
Well, I think, ironically, it's going to be very similar to, our talk is going to be very similar to last year's. And it is just a premeditated indecision that is driving the crisis deeper. The idea that so far, none of all the talk that has been, instilled on the political scene, whether it's reform, capital control, reforming the banks, any kind of social safety net, none of this has come to pass. Unfortunately, much of that time was wasted on fruitless conversation around the elections, the parliamentary elections. This has led to the election of around 10 so-called opposition MPs. So far, we haven't seen what they are in opposition to and what they intend to do. We haven't seen the difference. On the contrary, now I think what's different now, and also very similar, is that we're jumping onto another wagon, and that is the presidential elections. None of this matters. None of this has any impact on the crisis. And this is something that the political rulers of the country know exactly well. Mm-hmm. So they delve into these matters of no consequence, while just to purposefully ignore what is actually going on. And there's always like these milestones and these promises and these deadlines, but it never comes to pass. So everybody's just waiting for something. But that something will never come to pass. And this is very simple. The reason why is very simple. Nobody wants to mess with the structure of interests, that so-called Switzerland of the Middle East that you mentioned in your introduction. Well, that means that we're just a relic of a banking state that is completely bankrupt, and nobody wants to change the bank. Nobody wants to admit that the bank is bankrupt.
Wow. I mean, hyperinflation in Lebanon exceeds double figures. The Lebanese currency lira has been devalued of more than 90% since 2019. Added to this, the repercussions of the COVID-19 crisis, the Beirut port explosion, and I'm sure there is an impact from the Russia-Ukraine war. I recently witnessed an interview from a desperate Lebanese who was trying to leave the country on a boat, and this is his words. He was saying, "I would rather risk my life at sea than listen to the cries of my children when they are hungry." I mean, you're talking about this, nothing's happening. Dr. Masri, how did Lebanon get to this point? Are really politicians, are they tone deaf? I mean, how long can Lebanese endure?
I mean, Dr. Anis said it very powerfully when he called this situation premeditated indecision. And this is exactly what we have, premeditated indecision. It's not that our politicians, the politicians in power, let me be specific, not all the politicians. It's not that the politicians in power are tone deaf. They are beyond tone deaf. They are crippled and held hostage by a structure that they do not want to change. And the structure is not only the political sectarian system, which in and of itself breeds incompetence and corruption. It is a political sectarian system that is married to the banks that themselves for decades have put Ponzi schemes that many of your viewers in the United States would be familiar with. Well, the banks in Lebanon have taken Ponzi schemes to a whole new extreme. But these banks are married to the national bank, which is married to the sectarian political system, of which these politicians do not want to change. Now, either they don't want to change the structure because they are part of the structure, so they don't want to relinquish what they consider to be, what's left of their power, or they don't want to change the structure because their imagination is so lacking that they cannot envision anything else than what they have. Now, you asked the question as to how long can Lebanese endure, and this is a double-edged sword. Many political analysts in the West have looked to Lebanon and said, this is a country of resilience. These people are resilient. As Lebanese, we abhor the term resilience. Resilience is what has gotten us to this stage. It is because we have been so resilient, because we have adapted so long that we are at a stage now where we do not have electricity, we do not have a functioning internet, we do not have a functioning state, where our judges, imagine this, our judges and prosecutors are on strike. We are beyond the stage of no state. We are beyond the stage of chaos. And one of the reasons is because we, the Lebanese, have been too resilient. We have adapted too well. And we have let go of our own imagination of envisioning a country that we deserve, a country that is not held hostage by political sectarianism, a country that is not held hostage by foreign interest, and a country that rejects the status of Bashir Jmail and many of the other right-wing political parties in Lebanon that claim that our strength is in our weakness. So we are truly broken. We are truly at a stage of being broken as a country and as a society.
Lebanon scores 24 out of 100 in the Transparency International, this is a 2021 Corruption Perception Index, would you say corruption is a factor, Dr. Germani?
No,
Well,
if I could answer that, Anis, and then you could jump in.
go ahead.
Because,
Go ahead.
you know, this idea of corruption is one of the things that really infuriates me. You know, oh, we need to stop corruption in Lebanon. Corruption is not the problem in Lebanon. You cannot have a political sectarian system and not have it be corrupt. It is part of the structure that the country has been held hostage within for decades. So if you want to stop corruption in Lebanon, we have to build a secular state, you know, and a secular state does not mean there won't be corruption. A secular state opens the possibility for an end to corruption. But a sectarian state rejects the idea of no corruption because it is by design corrupt. It cannot but be corrupt. So all those that speak against corruption or call for transparency, that's not our problem in Lebanon. That's not our problem at all. You know, corruption is above the table in Lebanon. When it's so apparent, I wouldn't call it corruption. I would call it the system itself. I'm sorry, Anis, for interrupting.
Well, I mean, you said it well, but I would add maybe a small distinction, and that is the matter of secularism. And I think there are a lot of deeply flawed secular states. And as you've mentioned, yes, it's not a recipe for destroying, like annihilating corruption. But the issue with Lebanon, I think, goes back way further than just a few decades. I mean, the whole, the constitution of the political economy of Lebanon that started independence in the 40s was built around a perception, an imaginary that worked and failed multiple times. The idea that Lebanon is a country of trade, of banking, of finance, the idea that we do not produce, the idea that people need us even though we provide them with nothing. And when I say people, I mean foreign countries and foreign interests. All of these things, this artificial maybe identity that was rooted into the political economy, this in of itself is just, it holds so much influence over the Lebanese imaginary. And this wields this idea of personal entrepreneurship, the idea that you're really good by taking from somebody else. You're really good if you have more power, more influence, monopolies. That thing is corrupt, morally corrupt. But if we want to move it to the political, then, well, we go back to what Rania was saying, and that is that this is how the system functions. And we cannot, it's basically like diagnosing a body. If a body works that way, that does not mean that it's a virus or a bacteria that is corruption. It just is the way that it is. It's just not functional. And this is where we are today. So yes, eradicating corruption, fine. But what about the entrenched interests? The banking interests, the financial interests, the monopolies. What about those? These things can coexist with a completely transparent system. And so that means that corruption is not the issue. It's just how the structure is.
I think you've touched on this topic, Dr. Rania. I mean, you started talking about, and you said that before, the sectarian system is a key to resolving major issues. And we keep hearing about reforms. That's what I keep reading about. The IMF is asking Lebanon to, to come up with a budget and reforms. And what are reforms really, in your opinion? What's your vision for reforms?
There can be no reform within a political sectarian system. It's like giving aspirin to a patient who's dying of cancer. That the patient might feel a little better for a little while, but the patient will still die. What the reforms that they're talking about are reforms that will make Lebanon better for foreign interest and for foreign loans. They're not reforms that will make Lebanon better for the Lebanese society and for the millions of non-Lebanese that are also the responsibility of the Lebanese government. Those aren't the reforms that they're talking about. The reforms that the so-called opposition MPs are talking about are even smaller than those reforms. I mean, we can't even identify what those reforms are. So we are at a stage right now in Lebanon where we cannot be speaking about reform. We have to be speaking about transformation. It is, again, reforms go hand in hand with this concept of adapting and resilience. And we simply have nothing left to reform within the structure. I know, Anis, you want to speak more about the concept of reforms. your favorite opposition members in parliament.
I always find it ironic that the IMF is at the left of the Lebanese left in terms of what they're asking, and it's always important to remember that the IMF is an international financial institution. It is not an institution that cares about economies, and by economies I mean people. The idea is that their goals are strictly financial, and once they manage to balance the books so that a country that is bankrupt is able to take on more debt, and this is the essential criteria, just more debt, then they're fine. And they don't care about the people and the economy they live in, how they live, how they consume, their way of life. All of it does not matter. So even those reforms that are being pushed by the IMF, which are honestly the basics of the basics, and applying just that would even be criminal, even that is not even on the table today. Today, what is going on is that we're seeing two things. You have the reforms of the IMF that are always there in the rhetoric. At the same time, whenever the rhetoric goes way too high, you have the quote unquote reforms of the Lebanese banks. And these are two antagonizing projects that they are trying to marry in order to do nothing whatsoever. Because today, the Lebanese politicians or the people in power, they don't want to please the IMF, but anger the IMF too much, because once the illusion that we're going to be saved by the IMF falls apart, then they're going to have to be dealing with a lot of domestic anger. So what needs to happen today is truly a radical change. And I believe this is the problem. The problem today in Lebanon, if we want to boil it down to something, there is no radical opposition. There is no radical program. I'm talking about socializing healthcare, education, about redistributing wealth, resources, land. This is what we need. And anything shorter of that is not going to be able to do the transformation that Rania is talking about. But even more so, it is not going to push the people in power either to act or even to dig into their heels and for other people to work together to overthrow them. None of this is going to come to pass.
People here don't have an idea, really. I personally lost track about what the value of the Lebanese lira, for example. Mm-hmm. Just to give you an idea, Lebanese authorities still calculate custom tariffs at the old peg of 1,505 liras to the dollar. Yeah. And that's not real. I mean, how does this major devaluation, how does this impact, number one, the economy, and then the buying power for the average citizen, for people to understand what Lebanese are going through?
I mean, the devaluation itself does not impact the economy. The devaluation is a symptom of a failing economy, and this is what it is. Purchasing power is down in the drain, of course. The idea that we're going to keep, we want to refloat the banks by printing more lira, and this is the only thing that's happening. The printing of lira is a sort of a mechanism in order for the mass of people to pay the dues of the banks, and that is only, it is not driving the currency, the exchange rate down. It is not doing that. It is actually allowing people to buy stuff while still paying for the losses of the banks. This is kind of a small misconception about the Lebanese situation. But at the same time, the idea that the currency will still fail and will still be devalued just because we don't have enough dollars and we still import. We are still in a deficit, a much lesser deficit than before, because of the collapse of purchasing power. And the consequences of that are through the roof. And I can speak to this as a doctor. The patients that I'm seeing who suffer from complications due to lack of medication, the critical cases in hospitals that don't have access to essential antibiotics is just insane. The mortality, the infantile mortality rate tripled last year, which is one of the main indicators of how developed the healthcare system is. And this is already tripling. That means that the whole system is falling apart. So it's the tariff on the customs tariff, it being priced on the old peg, is not, if you want to talk about it in terms of purchasing power, it does not affect purchasing power today when it's at the 1,500 rate. It is a way of subsidizing the gains of importers, because importers are pricing their goods at the dollar rate or even more. But then once they will adjust or change the custom tax, they're going to increase it even more. So today, what's happening, that difference between the 1,500 rate in taxes versus the cost of goods is being pocketed by importers who monopolize the market. So this has actually no impact today on purchasing power, but in the future, once that tax is raised, these importers will raise the prices even more.
Going back to the banks, really, I mean, desperate Lebanese are robbing their own banks to access their own savings. Is this a trend, Dr. Masri, or, I mean, what's the psychological impact?
I wouldn't say they're robbing the banks. They are using arms, many a times plastic guns, to restore what the courts have failed to restore to them. They are going into the banks and taking their own money. And to my knowledge, all of them have not gotten all of their money. I mean, none of them have gotten all of their money. So they're not robbers. And when you used the expression earlier, take the law into their own hands, that's literally what they are doing. They are trying to enforce the law because the courts have chosen to be incompetent in enforcing the law. So they're not stealing. They're not taking anything that isn't theirs. They are trying to reclaim what is theirs. They are greeted as heroes throughout most of the Lebanese society. They are greeted with pride. They are greeted with glee. The vast majority of them have been men, but when one woman, Sally Hafiz, went to the banks with a plastic gun and she stood up, then she, social media started representing her as our Wonder Woman, our superhero. So in terms of what has been the psychological impact on the Lebanese people, I would argue that they have given a sense of hope and dignity and focus to the anger. However, is this the way forward for us all to take, plastic guns and try to reclaim our dollars in the banks? No, of course, it can't work that way. The banks will eventually retaliate with armed security. The armed security will eventually cause some harm, and this thing will escalate. Do I support what these individuals are doing in the banks? Unconditionally, yes, I most definitely do. But is this the way forward? No, it cannot be the way forward, because the way forward has to be much more organized with much more of a holistic vision. It has to be led by workers, by independent unions, of which we barely have any, by courageous political parties that demand transformation, by a real revolution, and not the kind of uprising protest that we had in 2019 that I refuse to call a revolution. Are we there yet in terms of the organizing power of political parties and the organizing power of workers and the imagination of the Lebanese? Unfortunately, no. So within this gap, here comes these, what has it been, 9-10 banks? Here come these individuals that have, shaken the country and given us a little bit of hope and energy in the process.
I mean, what do you expect from the banks? You said, well, they're going to have now more security, etc.
Oh, no.
I mean, are they going to give people their money? I mean, sorry for using the term robbing, because it sounds to me the banks are the robbers when they take your money. The banks are the robbers. They are not giving you back.
Are the robbers.
So with this, that's why I said it has a psychological impact of giving people hope. But then again, you've said the banks will retaliate. And so where is that going to lead you to?
I mean, the banks have retaliated by threatening a strike. And it's quite interesting in Lebanon that we have judges on strike, prosecutors on strike, and banks on strike. I mean, where else have you heard about this? And in this way, Lebanon is exceptional. And who actually goes on strike are the ones in power, and not the people that are oppressed and the people that are suffering. So the banks would retaliate by closing their doors for a few more days, maybe for a few more weeks. Once they open the doors, there will be these, these actions by people. They will come back. The banks are threatening to bring in armed security guards. Let us also remember that the armed security guards, the police force, the military in Lebanon are barely getting paid. They're barely surviving. They're barely making ends meet. So economically, if we look at it as a class struggle, they are on the same side as the people themselves who are taking back their own money. Where this will lead is to more chaos. Will the chaos then be taken advantage of by the people who should take advantage of it, the organizers, the leftist politicians, the people with vision? That becomes the question. That becomes the critical question in my perspective.
Well, I want to go back to the subject of reforms, or whether economically or politically, or you called it, I think, restructuring of this, or getting rid of the sectarian system. How is this possible when the exodus, number one, of young, educated Lebanese who are key to the country's future's recovery continues to happen?
Yeah, but does revolution really happen from the educated middle class? I'm not so sure. So yes, we are there is a massive change in the fabric of the society, most definitely. We are losing a significant percentage of our youth, as we have been losing since 1991, since the end of the physical violence of the Civil War and the beginning of the dramatic economic violence of neoliberalism. So let us keep the immigration into perspective. It has escalated over the past few years, but it did not begin in 2019. It really, in this flood, began in 1991. But in terms of, let me phrase it this way. Yes, we are seeing a restructure of Lebanese society. There are many people who are leaving, but there are also many people who cannot leave. Many workers who cannot leave because they are too poor, or because they have the wrong citizenship and the wrong papers. There is hope that maybe if those workers get organized, there is a movement that is starting to organize the delivery workers in Lebanon, which is the largest sector of workers in Lebanon. And these are workers that are not beholden to any political party. They are not beholden to any foreign interest. And they cover all of the country, and they are too poor to travel, too poor to emigrate. So there is a movement now to help organize those delivery workers and to let them become a powerful force to push the country towards a political transformation.
Dr. Germani, what steps should be taken to at least stop, maybe not resolve the economical issue, but stop the hemorrhaging that I guess the government needs to take, or before this thing keeps spiraling out of control, which it is?
Well, they can start by resigning. The idea that we can quell a hemorrhage without identifying, the causes of that hemorrhage, without addressing these causes. I mean, it's like slapping, a plaster on a huge wound, a gaping wound. It's not going to fix anything. So let's examine why people leave. They leave out of need and out of despair. Their needs are many. They need education, they need security, they need food, they need access to essential goods and medicine. All of these things, they need even the idea that in the future, if they stay in this country, they will have a decent future, a place where they can live a decent life, not under threat all the time by anything, by a collapse, by a bomb, by a war. So how can we deal with all of these things while saying, okay, I'm going to keep all the same regime that has been doing all of this to its population, but I'm going to stop the hemorrhage? It doesn't make sense. If we want to talk about today that would look like the declaration of the victory of a radical proposal. On that day, the hemorrhage would stop. People would be inspired to invest, at least to invest whatever time, effort, labor, and money they have left into this new project. But asking them to stay and sacrifice even more in a defunct system, I think this is just asking for too much at this point.
Dr. Masri talked about the real problem is the sectarian system. And I don't see a way out. I think you probably have better ideas, or you're more optimistic than me. I mean, is there a change? Because in order to do that, people have to kind of be behind it. I mean, do you see that something that is possible for the vast majority of Lebanese to say, we're going to, be a real democracy and not rely on the system?
There's a few things just to put it into historical context. Change never happens with the majority. It happens through the minority. So we don't really need the majority of Lebanese to feel one way or the other. And this applies wherever we are in the world. Change happens through an organized group of less than 15% of the population. That's one thing. Second thing is during crises, people lack imagination. They lack the ability to envision beyond their current state. And they have been trained for decades, if not hundreds of years, to accept crumbs presented to them as reform. Perhaps if you were to ask people 700 years ago, several hundred years ago, if they were to envision life without royal monarchs, they would have thought it was impossible, and they would simply have asked for a benevolent king. Now we find the idea of monarchs to be insulting and to be offensive, and I'm saying this during the funeral of Queen Elizabeth. The whole idea of a monarch is insulting and offensive. And we can say this now, but 100 years ago, this talk would have been ludicrous. The same applies today when we look at the political sectarian system in Lebanon. If we take into consideration that people are exhausted and people are beyond despair, and people have been trained through the structural violence of denying a real narrative in Lebanon, we have been trained to believe that there is no alternative but a political sectarian system. So consequently, from my perspective, the biggest challenge that we as political activists and political analysts have is to empower the imagination. So we can say, yes, there is an alternative to the political sectarian system. Just as myself, as a socialist, I constantly argue, yes, there is an alternative to capitalism. It is not capitalism, or nothing. Actually, capitalism will only lead to nothing. Same thing with the political sectarian system. It will only lead to nothing and more destruction. So how do we empower the imagination? And how do we empower the imagination while we're building unions, while we're building workers' collectives, while we're building organized oppositional political parties? This is the challenge that we have in Lebanon. And we have to do both those things in the midst of a horrendous financial and economic bankruptcy, which makes it, yes, extremely hard to imagine, but we have to, because we have no choice but to imagine it and but to organize for it. The other alternative is complete death and defeat.
But
I'll give you another example. But this week marks the 40th anniversary of Jamal, جبهة المقاومة الوطنية. جبهة المقاومة الوطنية, which was a coalition of ragtag, small political parties led by the Communist Party and the Syrian Social Nationalist Party and a few others, few leftist Palestinian parties. And they came together despite the feeling of despair in Lebanon to say, we will defeat the Israeli occupation of Beirut. And they did. So while we mark the 40th anniversary of Jamal, let us feel enriched by their victory to say, yes, today we will organize to defeat the political sectarian system. Let's at least have that as a plan and work towards it, instead of saying it is too impossible. How can we have reform of a destructive political system? How can I live with slightly less poverty? How can I live with less corruption? No, our people deserve it all.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one quick thing. The idea that so far, in this interview, we've only been discussing material issues in Lebanon. That's poverty and need and the crisis and all that. That means that this is the driving force behind everything that's going on in Lebanon today. So the idea of people not being able or willing to march behind a different project, I think this is wrong, because the premise is their material needs and their aspirations and the failing of the current system to meet any of these needs. So no change has in any case come to fruition in a context of peace and calm. It's always in times of disruption and even despair. And this is one of those situations. I think what's only lacking is a project that would supplant whatever ideological aspirations those sectarian parties instill in the minds of their citizens. So once there is this truly progressive leftist alternative that can take over that ideological part of the sectarian parties, then we can succeed. There is a hope for success because all the other factors are here.
Dr. Rania Masri and Dr. Anis Germani, thank you for sharing your insights on Arab Talk.
Pleasure.
My pleasure.
That's the voice and the faces of Dr. Rania Masri and Dr. Anis Germani talking about kind of the chaos and the difficulties and the upheaval that's going on in Lebanon right now, Jamal. I mean, I know we haven't talked about it for some time now, but the reality is things are worsening significantly for people in Lebanon right now. It's pretty dire.
It's very dire, Jess, and we've had them on the show in 2021, summer of 2021, and things
Right.
were really bad. And now they just sunk even deeper into that quagmire. I like the energy from both of our guests and their optimism. They're thinking of solutions. They're not throwing the white towel. They think that the Lebanese people can do better. They're just in a kind of caught in this sectarian system in Lebanon, and they see that getting rid of the sectarian system is the first step to any political
Right.
and economic stability for the country.
But that's ultimately the question. I mean, everybody's been speaking about that, saying that for many years now in Lebanon, but the reality is people in power in Lebanon are not ready to relinquish that sectarian political and economic structure that's been with the country, for forever now in the modern era. So the question I have for you, and I would have for doctors Masri and Germani, is what's it going to take for the elites in Lebanon to finally give up the ghost of the sectarian ruling structure? I don't know.
It's really the power of the will, as you've mentioned. And I don't want to say the Middle East is any exception. No one in power likes to relinquish power. We've seen it right here in this country with Trump.
True that.
But in the Middle East, just like any other places, it has to be driven through the will of people, sometimes sadly through revolutions or violence or what have you. But, those in power, man, historically, they just don't want to resign. I mean,
they don't.
Some they just don't want to leave, and we used to think, well, maybe it's the Middle East or maybe it's in third world countries. But hey, we've seen it right here in this country. We barely dodged the bullet with failing short, really, of just sending the Secret Service to drag Donald Trump out of the White House. He didn't want to leave.
No, he didn't want to leave. And there was a book that just came out recently that he basically told many of his intimate staff that he wouldn't leave. But that's another story. But I think your point is spot on, Jamal. This is not a uniquely Lebanese, Middle Eastern, or Arab issue. This is a uniquely human issue that has to do with people not wanting to give up power, economic power, political power, social power, even when there's, in the context of democracy. So Lebanon, I mean, but we have to, this show, we focus on the Middle East, and we have to say, in fact, that we have, since the Arab Spring, we have so many failed states now that we're confronting. I mean, Lebanon, to some extent, you could make an argument is failing or is a failed state. Syria is a failed state. Tunisia, we haven't spoken about recently, but now they're kind of walking back some of the gains that they got from the Arab Spring. So we're really in a situation, Libya, the list goes on. It's a very difficult time now in the Arab world, Jamal. It's a very, very difficult time.
That's right. We're going to move on to the next story, Jess. But before we do that, I just want us to remember Sabra and Shatila, which basically this month from the 16th to the 18th was the infamous massacre of Sabra and Shatila that also happened also in Lebanon. It's 40 years. I can't believe that's 40 years have passed since that infamous massacre, and probably will discuss it more in details next week or in the coming weeks.
That's right, Jamal. But let's talk a little bit about how it is for visitors to Palestine, specifically in the West Bank, whether or not they have to reveal their intimate partners. We spoke about this. There was a global outrage against the apartheid state for even doing something like this. Wow, surprise, surprise. It looks like they're revisiting this apartheid idea that you have to disclose your intimate partners.
Well, with a caveat, so
Of
don't
course.
get fooled by the headline. So for those who don't know, COGAT, that stands for Israel's Coordinator of Government Activities in the Territories. They failed to mention the occupied territories. They say the territories. What territories? The territories in China or in the Philippines? I don't know. But anyway, that's the COGAT. Recently announced that it was revising its forthcoming guidelines for entry into the West Bank by foreign nationals. And if you remember, there was a backlash, which we discussed, because they passed a new series of travel rules that are scheduled to be implemented this fall, including stipulation that foreigners had 30 days to report the start of romantic relationship with any Palestinian ID holder. So that's one of their draconian rules, in addition to this limiting the numbers of students, foreign students or foreign academics who are scheduled to teach in Palestine. So, except they really haven't, Jess, because two things. One, COGAT did remove its stipulation that foreigners must declare relationship with a Palestinian within 30 days of getting married, engaged, or moving in with them. That's, I'm just using their words here. However, the overall constraint remains. So according to their new rules, appointed COGAT officials must be informed as part of their request to renew or extend existing visas. In other words, individuals still have to report the information to COGAT, and still COGAT will determine their visa. Then they also revised the numbers of the added categories for permits for teachers, and they removed the cap of 100 they had before of visiting lecturers and 150 students at Palestinian universities. So they removed that part. So cosmetically, it looks like they made something, but they didn't.
But they haven't, Jamal. The reality is that they haven't. It's all cosmetic. It's not even as good as bad cosmetic surgery. It's easy to see through this. It's easy to see that this is part of the Hasbara kind of repackaging of these really, there's no other way to call it, but, grotesque apartheid practices, trying to control every aspect of life for Palestinians living in Gaza and the West Bank and Jerusalem. And not only Palestinians, but also people visiting, whether it be academic professors or students coming to study in Palestine. I don't see it as any. What's different is the packaging, right?
Well, not only this, that's actually half the story. So half the story, of course, it's all smoke and mirrors to say, look, we listened to you because of the backlash of the international community didn't like that and basically mocked that decision. The second half of the story, Jess, it's tied to the visa waiver program.
Right.
So that's the real motivation behind COGAT minor revision, if you want to call them minor revisions. So Israel has been Israel, and I should say its surrogates in Congress. They've been fighting tooth and nail to be granted what we call it the United States waiver, a visa waiver program, which allows basically citizens of foreign countries to come to this country and stay here for 90 days without obtaining a visa at the embassy. They want to join basically what we grant EU countries, for example, or the UK. So that you can fly in here and just like Americans fly into France and get 90 days. So they have been lobbying for this, especially more now since September 2021 with President Biden, and then of course progressive politicians. They said, "Hey, wait a minute, what about all these crazy rules that you pass on foreign visitors, especially if they are Palestinian Americans or Muslim Americans or Arab Americans visiting Israel, and all that investigation, etc. We cannot give you that because you discriminate against citizens of the United States. And that's why their visa waiver program has been on hold,
Right.
practically frozen for many years, and they've just been dying. Netanyahu tried his best, and he's the longest ruling prime minister of Israel, did not succeed.
Right.
Even during the Trump administration, they've succeeded to moving the embassy into Jerusalem, but did not succeed because several congressmen and women and senators raised that issue. It's like, if you want us to do that, you cannot bring Dr. Jess Jamal when he travels to Jerusalem,
Right.
to the investigation room for an hour,
That's right.
and possibly deny him a visa because of his Palestinian background, and so they're now trying different things. They've created these crazy rules. They just basically, what do they want you to? They just increase their rules basically against Palestinian Americans, and then they want to negotiate to walk back some of these rules if the United States grants them that waiver. And I hope the administrations, members of this administrations, the White House, the State Department, who are listening to us on this show, not fall into that trap.
Because here's the trap, Jamal. You're exactly right. If this change were to be made, and they would be granted special privileges under the visa waiver rule, one day after that were to happen, if it were to happen, they would go back and change all the COGAT would go and change all the rules all over again. We know that this is just a ploy. This is just a marketing ploy by the apartheid state to get what they want. They continue to do the draconian, oppressive rules that govern all aspects of existence for Palestinians and visitors to Palestine on a daily basis. I mean, why would the State Department go along with this joke, Jamal?
Because of the pressure of course, AIPAC. Why would congressmen and congresswomen and senators vote in favor of Israel? What I'm saying here, just if they go along with this program, they're granting waiver visas to apartheid. They are endorsing apartheid. I mean,
but they have endorsed them. They have endorsed apartheid.
Yeah, but this is even bigger than this, because that's, it's apartheid practiced not only on Palestinians living in Palestine, in historic Palestine, but also on American citizens who happen to be of the wrong ethnicity or the wrong religion, trying to visit the country. That's also apartheid on the border, basically. And why should they be given preferential treatment coming to the United States?
Well, and I think that's the way it needs to be addressed to Congress people. Why are we rewarding apartheid? Why are we supporting apartheid? Why are we rewarding this oppressive regime by giving its citizens special privileges when it continues to oppress and use these apartheid practices? I mean, I'm sure we're going to continue to follow this story, Jamal. We're going to follow it a long time.
You're listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. We got to talk about the story of the past 2 weeks almost. Yes, I mean, wall-to-wall coverage.
Non-stop, Jamal.
On US TV, and I know on Western media in general, but in the United States, it's like, I haven't watched. I mean, we have a hurricane striking Puerto Rico. I haven't, very little coverage of that. We have all kinds of issues coming here with the economy, with rising interest rates and so forth. But anyway, you turn on the TV and you're just watching basically British news. Like, it's just like you transported BBC onto CNN or what have you.
That's right.
Wall-to-wall coverage, without really discussing the history and the background of the British monarchy and its effect in a very negative way globally with this whole colonial period. Just, I mean, I don't know where to begin. I mean, just to...
Well, let's begin in the 1930s, Jamal, with the partition and occupation of Palestine, of historic Palestine, by the British Empire in 1917. I'm sorry. Shouldn't we start with that? Shouldn't we start?
Well, yes, that's one actually small part of these. I mean, if we talk about this, I mean, we know the history that led to the Balfour Declaration, the Sykes-Picot, the division of the whole Arab world, and the mess that has been created, redrawing the map of the Middle East and so forth. Others might argue, for example, in India, at the height of the British Empire after World War One, Britain had colonies on every continent, save Antarctica, ruling 1 out of 5 people in the world. This is the number. So if you talk to someone from India, I was like looking over the centuries, Britain extracted wealth from those colonized lands by one estimate of $45 trillion in today's money from India alone. $45 trillion from India alone. So yes, Palestine, of course, suffered tremendously, but you got people from India. Then you talk about after they lost India, they put all their focus in the British Empire on after the loss of India in 1947, I should say. Kenya became the jewel, becomes one of the jewels in the crown that we see, along with Malaya, in part because of the major source of cash, crop production, etc. So if you look at it also, of all the profiteering, let's start with that, without even talking about the death and destruction of all these former colonies
and I think that's exactly right, Jamal. Basically what's happening now, they're giving a period of mourning, but what you're hearing and reading about throughout the Commonwealth and the former colonies and current and former colonies is that you're hearing that once Queen Elizabeth has had her, period of mourning and respect, the whole issue of breaking away from the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth is coming up again. And this includes Northern Ireland, it includes Scotland, it includes all of the British colonies in the Caribbean and Africa. And, it's just like it goes on and on and on. And that there was a period of time where this was kind of quiet because people had so much regard and respect for the Queen. But now that she's passed and moving on, and you have now King Charles III, people are going to revisit this. So I think, we're probably poised for a very significant re-examination, including kind of payment back, the restitution of the plunder that the British Empire took.
Well, that's not what we are seeing on...
Not on TV.
Not on TV. And I understand there is a mourning period, but also there is context here. And it's like as if...
There's no context
the
provided.
way they describe it is like, that nothing happened during her reign or her father's reign or her uncle's reign. Everything is hunky-dory. She's a great-grandmother to many people who are paying respects. You have to discuss the effect of colonialism, British colonialism in particular, on the world. And when the way I see it, just plain and simple, it's whitewashing colonialism.
Absolutely. And she was the perfect person to do it.
I've been watching whitewashing colonialism now since she passed away on CNN, on NBC, and the rest of the network, and no one is questioning this. I mean, it's fine to report the news of a monarch has passed, and if you don't want to get or you don't want to delve into the details, but to go out of your way to put this show like a Hollywood show
It is
Really,
a Hollywood show.
it's a
No, it
Hollywood,
is.
BBC production just on American TV about, all these
Yeah, no, I think it's a
colors
very
and more, and say, well, I'm sorry. I mean, for a lot of people, the British monarchy brought a lot of pain, a lot of suffering that they basically have not apologized for till now. They haven't paid restitution, and people are still suffering from what they've done.
I think that's a point that we're going to be covering, Jamal, because King Charles is not going to enjoy the same courtesy that the Queen did in terms of giving a pass to the British Empire and its devastation and plunder of all these countries. So I think King Charles needs to put his seatbelt on, Jamal, because it's going to be a rough ride starting very, very soon.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we'll speak to you next week.
See you next week.